Alrighty, we're going to start with chapter 15, and this is a chapter geared strictly towards Reconstruction and what's going on in the post-Civil War America. With every module, I'll have the chapter objectives. Keep in mind multiple modules under one chapter will have the same objectives, but just keep in mind that you're able to respond to these if they were to appear on an exam, hint, hint. So, embracing freedom. If you were to ask each of the following demographics below to define freedom, most likely you would probably get a very different answer from each one. The issue of race is one that really comes very strongly out in the Reconstruction period. You have the emancipation of former slaves or enslaved peoples who are now looking to gain citizenship, but you have these kind of ambiguous terms being floated around about what is freedom, what is citizenship, what does it mean to be free. And so each of these people reflect a different aspect of that. So you can imagine a former enslaved male would be very different from what a small Southern farmer who probably would be white would respond to. Free black laborers were throughout the South. Usually in the South, though, if you were a free black, you were encouraged to leave the South. Many states began to enact codes towards the end of slavery, banning free blacks from even being within the state. Of course, Southern planters, industrial workers, Northern capitalists all have a different kind of input on what freedom would mean. One of the things that's very interesting about Reconstruction is the idea of family. Most Southerners were stunned to find out that enslaved people did have their own family. It's not a surprise to us, but it was a surprise to them because they didn't recognize it. So if a enslaved man and woman were married, there was no formal ceremony and no record of that. So in the days coming after the Civil War, many enslaved people began to look for their families. This would mean migration to other areas of the South. So enslaved men would look for their wives or children and vice versa. So there was a lot of movement taking place, which was very interesting in the post-war South because most whites never even considered the fact that a slave marriage was true or existed because, of course, they didn't allow it. This is one of many surprises, I'm sure. But when you ask, or when enslaved men and women were asked about what their view of freedom was, many of them responded with, self-ownership, family stability, religious freedom, political participation, economic autonomy. These are things that just seem kind of natural to us, but these were things that they viewed, or enslaved men and women viewed as important now that slavery was over. Keep in mind the term free labor does not mean labor that is no longer enslaved. Think of it back as in terms of the free soil movement back in Bleeding, Kansas, when it was basically self-ownership, perhaps is the best way to describe it, or economic autonomy, that a man or woman could have a job of their choosing and get paid for their labor. Now, it did not mean that they were paid a handsome sum. It did not mean that they were given housing or clothing or anything else. It just meant that they were paid, for their work. Compare it to kind of an industrial worker. So when many Northerners are coming down to the South and claiming this idea of free soil of free labor, they're talking about the free soil movement and this idea of wage labor. To the right, underneath the picture of O.O. Howard, is the Freedmen's Bureau marriage certificate. And one of the things that the Freedmen's Bureau did in the days after the Civil War was they sought out documenting slave marriages. And so this was one of the ways in which the Freedmen's Bureau really transforms African American rights in the way that they're envisioning their lives, because now there's a formal record of their marriage. This was never done before because, of course, whites did not allow slaves to have legal marriages. And so now we're seeing documentation post-Civil War of what these families really represented and how important they were within the slave society even before the end of the war. So Port Royal experiment, early in the war, about 1861, you have the confiscation of Confederate plantations along the Sea Islands. The Union Army comes in and establishes a headquarters at Port Royal. And so the question comes, what do we do with contraband? And contraband, they referred to enslaved men and women as contraband because they represented an economic element to the Old South, not because they were trying to dehumanize them per se. But when unions set up their lines of communication and their forts and what have you in terms of being in charge of a certain area, the enslaved men and women would literally flock to the Union lines. And so they had this big question in South Carolina along the Sea Islands where they had huge numbers of slaves. What do we do with these people? And so one of the Union generals comes up with the idea of talking to the American Missionary Society and the Freedmen's Bureau and many others about bringing teachers down to teach the enslaved men and women how to write and read and balance budgets and, be able to run basically their own farms or plantations. And so they gave the land back to the enslaved peoples to grow cotton. And in many cases, they established themselves as very profitable. And so it's important to know that this was an experiment that gets shot down by President Andrew Johnson, but it is really kind of what Reconstruction was supposed to be about, handing over the land to the enslaved peoples who had worked them for so long. And in many cases, enslaved peoples began to think of that land as their own because they worked it. They knew it, they understood it, they understood the cycles of crops, and what they could do in terms of making money from it. A couple of things to keep in mind about the Port Royal experiment. Esther and John Hawks are two people that come down to South Carolina. They eventually make it all the way down to Florida. But John Hawks was a doctor and Esther was his wife. Esther is also a doctor. And so they were there to help with the enslaved peoples. But they also begin to get involved in the schools and teaching African Americans how to read and write. And so their next port of call will be Jacksonville, and then they move on to Port Orange. But they, wherever they went, they established a school to teach African Americans how to read and write. Later, the Union will enlist these former slaves into the colored troops. And this had a twofold reason. One, the Union was beginning to have a hard time recruiting soldiers from the North, especially after the war turns into a war against slavery. And so many whites, especially Irish, had a problem with fighting against slavery. Preserving the Union was a different thing, but slavery was certainly not what they had envisioned fighting for. Anyway, a man named Thomas Higginson is in charge of the 1st South Carolina Infantry, and then there's another gentleman, last name's Montgomery, who is in charge of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry. And these are enslaved men from Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina who are brought into the Union Army. They come to Jacksonville, and they actually take occupation of Jacksonville for a while, and then launch a number of raids up and down the St. Johns River. But there's a picture in the bottom kind of right of the soldiers standing at attention, and that was the 1st and 2nd South Carolina Infantry. The other issue that Sherman runs into is during his March of the Sea, as he's moving south. Um, Wherever he goes, he runs into former slaves, and so they pick up their stuff and they start marching with him. So much so that by the time he gets through to Savannah, he's got this huge entourage of enslaved peoples that have run away with him, and he's trying to figure out what to do with it, or what to do with them. Now, keep in mind, Sherman is kind of a radical Republican. I wouldn't necessarily say that for certain, but he does have this idea of enslaved peoples being able to own land and be able to grow their own crops. And so he has a meeting January 16th of 1865 with several African American leaders, and as a result of that, he sends out this special field order number 15, which you can see the map on the right, creates the Sherman Reservation, which were confiscated lands from former Confederates that the slaves are now, or the former slaves are now able to take ownership of. They will gain 40 acres of land, and this is where we believe the idea of the 40 acres and a mule comes about. This is a short-lived thing as well as a Port Royal experiment because Andrew Johnson gives the land back to the former Confederates. But for a short period of time, this is, again, an element of the land reform. Radical Republicans passed the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which opened public land in Alabama, Florida, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. At first, these were 80-acre parcels of land, and then they grow up to 160 acres parcels. Keep in mind, most of this land is not really good land. This is like swampland or land that the government had taken control of, public land, it's government owned, because it wasn't really profitable for anyone else to own it, if that makes sense. So this is where they would build roads or railroads or bridges and that sort of thing. You had a number of restrictions that you had to make before you could gain a claim. Let's see, go in here. You had to occupy the land and cultivate it for 5 years before you were able to gain full ownership. And remember, this is the idea of using the land. Cultivate means, you farm it, you build buildings, you build a home, you build a barn, you build things so that it's going to be a profitable farmland. Many former slaves are attracted to this deal, and so you have a large number of former enslaved men and women from the South Carolina area that take advantage of this, and they begin to migrate away from the Sea Islands, which is where the Gullah Geechee culture develops. And so we now have today what we call the Gullah Geechee corridor, largely because of the migration that these men and women undertook in order to take advantage of the Southern Homestead Act. Some of the failures of the land is that the land was still relatively expensive for an enslaved person. Keep in mind, there's no money that's being given to these men and women to buy land. They are essentially kind of have to raise their own money in order to do it. And there are no masters anymore to give them money or to rent themselves out, to these masters in order to gain money. So it's hard for them to gain cash in order to put down on this land. So a lot of speculation takes place where you have companies that come in, buy up this land through the Homestead Act. And unfortunately, it's not a real big win for former enslaved peoples. Couple of things real quick. Obviously, the railroads are destroyed post-Civil War. Many of the cities, especially Charleston, Richmond, Atlanta, are literally just burned to ruins. The infrastructure in place is horrible. And so you don't have a great deal of potential to restart the economy without an influx of capital. And that capital comes in the form of Northerners who begin to see the South as a way to make a great deal of money in coming in and buying up, sawmills and railroads and investing in the South But the government isn't doing it. These are wealthy capitalists who see the opportunity and start coming into the South in order to um, really better themselves, but in the long run, it's going to benefit the South as well. So, keeping in mind how the economic picture looks, it's pretty dismal in the South because you have this huge investment of slaves, which is just literally wiped off the books. So, imagine if you went out and you bought a car. Everybody had a car in the United States, and all of a sudden, the government comes out and says you don't own that car anymore, and all of that money is now just turned to zero. It's zero in the balance book. That's what we're talking about in the South. Whether or not you agree with, slavery, which I don't, but keep in mind it was an investment for a white planter. Um, we, you know, take out the moral implications of that, if you will. Um, the South still remains a cash crop economy. Even in the quote unquote new South of the post Civil War era, cotton is still king. And so, what happens in a cash crop economy is that people begin to grow only one cash crop, which is cotton. They don't really grow anything else. And the idea is if you grow more of it, the more you will get in money. Well, that could be true, but the problem is that if everybody's growing it, then it just kind of is overproduction. The crop lien system basically, you put a lien on your crop. So let's say you go to a planter and you say, I need to borrow your tractor. And he says, okay, well, you can borrow it, but I'm going to put, a $200 lien on your crop. So when you come out for harvest and you turn your crop in, you get $500. That means you got to give $200 to the person that you borrowed the tractor from, and then the rest is yours. Sharecropping is kind of a compromise between white landowners and black labor because black labor, they're able to work their own land, they're able to live in a house on their own. It's not the same thing as a plantation system. White landowners still have control, economic control over the black labor though. And they do this through kind of a manipulation of the crop lien system. So, at the beginning of the growing season, when you needed seed and you need shovels or rakes or whatever, you would go into the store, which just happened to be owned by the white landowner, and you would say, I need supplies, and they would say, okay, it's going to be $100. We're going to put this on your bill. So, kind of at the end of the year, when you go and settle up, you got to pay off what you bought in the beginning of the season. Plus interest, and the interest rate was usually pretty steep. Keep in mind, too, that if you're in a cash crop economy, you want to grow as much cotton as possible. So you tend to not grow a garden or have a garden. So you're borrowing from the company store, food like potatoes or meat or things that you would normally get on your own, you're not able to get anymore because you're growing cotton in order to make the most out of your crop. They didn't quite really understand the whole supply and demand idea here is what I'm trying to get at. And so oftentimes, because sharecropping was this kind of crop lien system gone bad, you had many black laborers who owed more at the end to their white landowners. And it was just this cyclical kind of process that just kept going on and on. So you would, may owe $30 at the end of the year, but then at the end of another growing season, tack on another $40. So it would grow over time. And at the same time, you're getting charged interest. So it's a bad credit card scheme. Think of it that way. Here's an image of sharecropping. Sharecroppers provided land and seed, and he promises the landowner half the crop. Sharecropper buys food and clothing on credit. Sharecropper plants and harvests crop, gives the landowner the crop to sell. Sharecropper will get half minus the cost of his purchases. When settling up, the landowner sees that he owes more than he's earned. So to pay the debt, he must promise the landowner a greater share of next year's crop. This is what I'm talking about. It's a cycle of poverty. And this is how it develops over the course of several decades in the South, in the post-Civil War South. So how do we go from the end of the Civil War? Of course, Lincoln's assassinated. Andrew Johnson comes to the presidency. So, we've got this idea of presidential Reconstruction that runs from 1865 to 1867. Johnson has what he calls his 10% plan, which is essentially that 10% of the population of the state swears, as long as they swear allegiance to the United States, then the state can come back into the Union. They can write a constitution, they can do whatever they want, and then they're back in. Keep in mind, Johnson is coming from a border state, a former southern state, Tennessee. He remained loyal to the Union, and Tennessee is it was a border state, so it didn't actually cede from the Union. And this creates a question of secession. And Lincoln always referred to the Confederate States as states in rebellion. He never called them the Confederate States. He never said that they ceded from the Union. He always just referred to them as states in rebellion, meaning that they never actually left the government. So chances are that Lincoln's plan is very similar to what Johnson would have done. But the problem is that you've got these Republicans who want revenge. So this becomes kind of the issue. And you have a diagram down here of two different Reconstruction plans. Lincoln and Johnson, again, very similar, easier on the Confederates. They wanted to make the healing process a lot quicker. They offer amnesty to Confederates. And so when Johnson approves these people or these states to come back in, he pardons some of the Confederates and he encourages the states to create new constitutions. That's all well and good until the radical Republicans take over Congress. And it comes through a midterm election. And so all of a sudden now you've got Republicans who are pushing for more strict policies. In terms of Florida, in 1868, Florida is one of those states that Johnson allows to come back into the Union. And their constitution is written, and they enforce what they call the Black Codes. And these are really throughout most of the southern states that are writing constitutions under presidential Reconstruction. And largely what they do is they restrict the movement of African Americans within the state. Certainly requires them to pay a poll tax or a literacy test or grandfather clause in order to make sure that their votes are not counted. But it also requires them, if they are found guilty of a crime, to work their fine off. So one of the things, and we'll talk about this in the Constitution, that comes about is that slavery is no longer allowed, except in the case, and it's not really slavery, it's indentured servitude, except in the cases of committing a crime or paying a fine. So typically what would happen is an African-American male might be walking down the street and one of the officials would stop him and ask him for a labor contract. Are you employed anywhere? And if he could not produce a labor contract, then they would arrest him for vagrancy. And then the charge for vagrancy was like maybe $50, $100. And so typically they were not able to pay it, and so they would go work their fine off. And in many cases, you have the rise of what we call peonage, which is where basically it's convict labor. The state would rent these men out to go work, usually in the turpentine industry, and the state would get a kickback of, let's say, $100 a person. And at the same time, keep in mind, in the post-Civil War South, a lot of the buildings and jails were destroyed in the war, so they didn't have any way to house prisoners. So these camps would come, they would go to these turpentine camps out in the middle of the woods where they would have these wooden bunk houses, and that's where they would stay until their fine was paid off. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 tries to define what a citizen is. And this is, as I said, there are these kind of big terms that get kind of tossed around, and citizenship and liberty and all of this are part of that. And so the Republicans they passed this law, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and try to get citizenship defined. They also are trying to push through the Freedmen's Bureau and expanding or extending the Freedmen's Bureau. The law that created it had come to an expiration date, and they were trying to continue it. Johnson vetoes both of these. However, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is the first law that receives a override by Congress in American history, and so it passes against Johnson's veto. And of course, you can see in the picture to the right, it's a portrait of Johnson, and it's got a crown that says, "I am king." This is kind of what's being cast as Johnson's view from the radical Republicans, that he's trying to take control of what should be the powers invested in Congress. Not exactly true, I don't think, but it's a way that they're able to get support for the radical Republican agenda and take it away from the presidential Reconstruction plan. Also at the bottom, you see this kind of depiction of the Freedmen's Bureau, and this was to vilify the Freedmen's Bureau. That basically the Freedmen's Bureau was a way for African Americans to just kind of sit around while white people worked, and tax money was being given to African Americans to do whatever they wanted to do. Obviously not true, but this is part of the vilification of the Freedmen's Bureau. So we talked about the Civil War amendments. These hopefully are not surprising to you, but it's interesting because the 13th Amendment basically abolishes slavery except as a punishment for crimes for which a person in question shall have been duly convicted. This is how Southern states are able to get through peonage and through forced labor, because they can charge them with something and then they can just make the fine huge, and so the men will have to go and work. So it's kind of a way to create a labor force through force. The map of the United States shows the states in blue were ratified the Constitution, or ratified this amendment, 13th Amendment, 1865. The ones in green ratified it after it was enacted, so between 1865 and 1870. The states in purple ratified the amendment after first rejecting it, which is kind of interesting because Delaware, New Jersey, really? New Jersey ratifies it in 1866, Kentucky ratifies it in 1976, and good old Mississippi ratified it in 1995, believe it or not. 14th Amendment, this was a touchy one because there are several cases that are involved with the 14th Amendment. Plessy versus Ferguson, which creates the idea of segregation and the separate but equal principle. And then in 1955, or 54, you have Brown versus Board of Education, which nullifies Plessy versus Ferguson. So how can two Supreme Court cases basically nullify each other by citing the same amendment? Crazy. But it's all in how you read the due process clause, and that's the most important element. And this is the idea that it prohibits states and local governments from depriving people of life, liberty, or property without a fair procedure. So go figure. Roe versus Wade also figures in this. Bush versus Gore, which settled the 2000 presidential election. And then the same-sex marriage case was also part of use the 14th Amendment as well. So you got to have equal protection, due process. It repealed the Three-Fifths Compromise. Um, it's a big deal. The 14th Amendment is really the biggest of the Civil War amendments, I think. Again, this is a map showing who ratifies it. Not a big deal, I guess. The 15th Amendment gives the right to vote, and it should not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This, of course, gives the right to vote on a federal level. Problem is, Congress is the one that's going to be enforcing it. So it doesn't really provide any real substance in terms of how to enforce it. And that will only come in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act by LBJ. So we're talking about 100 years later when the implementation of this amendment is given some teeth. What's interesting about this is that this really put the women's suffrage movement in a very difficult position, because many of the suffragettes were pushing for equal rights for African Americans because of their shared discrimination around voting. And then all of a sudden, African Americans are given the right to vote, but women are not. And so they left out gender as one of the qualifiers. And so this was a big source of contention within the suffrage movement. So radical Reconstruction, they passed the Reconstruction Act, which basically divides the South into military districts. You have Johnson, who comes along and fires Edwin Stanton. Is it Edwin? Or Edward? I think maybe Edward. I don't know. Anyway, Secretary of State. Secretary of War. Stanton was the one. He's a radical Republican through and through, and so he and I guess it isn't Edward Stanton. Congress passes this law, the Tenure of Office Act, where any cabinet member who is let go cannot, any cabinet member cannot be let go without congressional approval, which of course Johnson throws in their face and says, well, forget you, I'm firing him anyway, and so Edwin Stanton gets fired. So this is how Congress brings Johnson up for impeachment. And he basically narrowly escapes being impeached by one vote, but he certainly kills any chances of being reelected at this point. But one of the few presidents that's been brought up for impeachment. Within the South, as I mentioned, you have these wealthy Northerners who are coming down into the South. Keep in mind, in the South, cash is scarce. Everything, even within the cash crop economy, is done by credit. So very rare that you have people walking around with lots of cash. And so you have these Northerners that come down with a lot of cash, and they're really able to buy up land, buy up homes, property very quickly because they have cash. And these men are referred to as carpetbaggers because they had these big bags, usually filled with cash, that they would bring down and basically buy up property and homes and that sort of thing. Not very well liked by the South. Scalawags were even worse because these were Southerners who were basically Republican supporters. So within the state government, you start to see, state and local government, you start to see many African Americans emerge as leaders. A lot of this is because of the political activism that many former slaves begin to display, largely through the Union League, which was a group that was tied to the Republican Party, that would support kind of a unionist platform that denigrated the South and the Confederacy. And so you have, within the local governments, under the Radical Reconstruction, black office holders who begin to rewrite these state constitutions. And so um, once these constitutions are presented to Congress, they're reviewed, and then Congress votes on them whether or not to accept them. And keep in mind, most of the people doing the reviewing are radical Republicans, and so they're going to favor heavily the Republican Party. Education, of course, continues with the missionary societies, just as Port Royal saw the American Missionary Society continues to send teachers into the South for these African American schools. Freedmen's Bureau as well. St. Augustine and Jacksonville both had a large number of these schools develop. Typically what would happen is during the day, the children of former slaves would come and learn. And then in the evenings, the teachers would teach the adults when they were not working. So it was basically kind of like a 24-hour school thing going on, if you can imagine. And African Americans embraced education. You have a large number of predominantly African American schools that began to develop very quickly after the war. Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia, started in 1865. It becomes Morehouse. Fisk University in Nashville in 1866. Fisk you'll hear more about when we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, because it becomes a hotbed of civil rights activism. Hampton University in 1868, and Howard University in Washington, D.C. in 1867. These are all colleges and universities where they are catering to the African American population, and many of them are, become the leaders, the movers and shakers of the African American community in the post-war time. Jacksonville, we have local schools. The Sisters of St. Joseph and St. Augustine expand across Florida into Mandarin and Jacksonville, and then into Tampa and Orlando, opening schools for African American children. And again, many of these have evening classes for adults as well. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a resident in Mandarin, opens up her own community school. Again, Esther and John Hawkes in Jacksonville and Port Orange. In Jacksonville, you have Edward Waters in 1866, Cookman Institute in 1872, and the Florida Baptist Institute in Live Oak. Cookman Institute becomes Bethune-Cookman. It moves from Jacksonville down to Daytona and merges with the Bethune school down there, industrial school. Edwards Waters is, I think, is still existent in downtown Jacksonville. Florida Baptist Institute will move from Live Oak to Jacksonville and then actually come down to St. Augustine. And then in the 60s, it moved further south and is now Florida Memorial University. So it's still around. So in basically the end of Johnson's term, you have the election of 1868, which brings Ulysses S. Grant, a former Union general, to the White House. Grant has kind of a hard time. He has a slight drinking problem, which becomes very well known to the American people. But he was pretty well liked, I would say. He wins the election by kind of a small majority. But alas, he still wins over the Southern Democrat. So Grant kind of comes into the White House, and there are a number of things that take place during Reconstruction, and things that happen within his administration that kind of begin to focus the opponents of Reconstruction onto trying to end it. Because they're wondering at what point is the South going to be free of these military districts? And keep in mind, they're military districts because they're being occupied by the military. So Southerners are living amongst Union soldiers who are stationed within the cities and towns across the South. You have race riots that erupt in Colfax and Memphis, Tennessee, and Colfax, Louisiana, where literally people are burned out of their houses and killed. You have the KKK that emerges out of the Knights of the White Camellia. Other people argue it had different origins, but nonetheless, this is the first incarnation of the KKK. And you can see in the middle what the uniform looked like. If that were riding towards me, I would be freaked out no matter what. Reminds me of the very, very early pictures of Mickey Mouse, which was really scary. You can Google that later and figure that out. And so you have this racial violence that begins to envelop the South. And so the radical Republicans passed the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871 in order to bring the South into control. It largely does not work. I'll just say that. The KKK also targets not only African Americans or former slaves who might be trying to, get a job, against a white person or own a business that challenges another white person's business. They also focus on liberal Republicans, on Republicans who come to the South and are trying to help African Americans through education or through job training. And so you have white store owners and white businessmen who are also targeted, as well as African Americans. So we come to the election of 1874. The Democrats have made some gains. And so you don't have the radical Republican control that you once had. The last big piece of legislation of radical republicanism is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It does not pass. And this is largely because of a number of things that we're beginning to see. The Northerners are retreating from radical Reconstruction. They're tired of it. By this point, it's over 10 years of dealing with military districts, Union soldiers being in the South, which are their husbands, their sons, their brothers, friends. So can't we just kind of all get along and send our soldiers back home? They're just tired of it. The South is still very much not going to bend to the Republican agenda, and so they're finding out ways to restrict African Americans from gaining their full rights. And so what you begin to see when we hit the election of 1877 is really it's an anomaly. The election does not produce a clear winner. And so the question comes up of how are we going to end the stalemate? It's ironic because the stalemate exists in terms of Reconstruction. How are we going to end Reconstruction? How are we going to solve this predicament? And so they merge the two issues together and they create what they call the bargain of 1877. And essentially it gives the White House to the Republicans, but in return, the Republicans will end Reconstruction, essentially pull the military out of the South and allow state and local governments to function on their own again. And so this is typically the end of Reconstruction. One of the big reasons why the Republicans agreed to this is because in 1873 you have a panic, which is not a depression, but it's not a good period of economic productivity. So in return, the Republicans are much more focused on solving the economic crisis rather than worrying about whether or not African Americans are going to be able to vote. And that's just the way it is. And so you have what we call the Redeemers. These are Democratic leaders who come to power through state and local elections following the retreat from radical Reconstruction. So when Reconstruction ends, you have Democratic leaders who come back into power. It's not long before we have their new constitutions passed, which have poll taxes and disenfranchisement all throughout. And again, peonage is, again, a thing in the Constitution. So this is the period of what we would call Jim Crow, and it all starts really with the bargain of 1877. A couple of images that I want to end with. The picture on the left is talking about Colfax, and this is essentially an African American man looking up to heaven and asking why. Why did this happen, and where is the justice? And then you have the picture on the right of the KKK member with the White League, which again are keeping African Americans, quote unquote, in their place. This is a white man's government, the Union as it was. So this is kind of depicting what's going to happen as we move forward, unfortunately, into the Jim Crow era.